Hello everyone. As you may know, YouTube recently retired the classic captioning tool and replaced it with its new iteration. While the core mechanics remained the same, the interface got revamped and some features were added, changed or replaced. Right now, it's still very fresh and can be rough around the edges, so I'll go through the things that grabbed my attention during the time I've been poking around it and make some suggestions. Keep in mind that I'll be looking at it from the perspective of someone dedicated solely to captioning, and thus not interested in cutting any corners. Someone who has to seek a compromise between creating their content and producing captions may very well be fine with things as they are. Furthermore, I know that the tool already had some external testing, and what I see as problematic, someone else may have wanted just so. With that in mind, for the most part, I don't pose my feedback as suggestions for changes, but rather as suggestions for options to have. I believe that allowing the tool to be customizable is the best way of making it versatile. Alright, first let's see what's new. The most immediate change you can see is that the editor is now displayed on its own static layer, so no more annoying scrolling up and down the page. All the elements are clear and the layout is uncluttered. In fact, it's more spread out than before, so every element is easy to find. Helpful if you're new to captioning. Next, the number of hotkey combinations you can use has increased dramatically, and they're all cataloged in this list. If you have the knack for typing, you can finish entire tracks with your fingers barely leaving the keyboard. The text on the previous screen shrunk in size a bit. I thought it was so it would represent the final size of the line after it's published, but no, it's still not one-to-one. One of the hotkeys allows you to make the preview full screen, and I initially assumed it was so you could preview the way things would look in full screen before publishing. Yet again, the text is small there too, so I guess this change is simply a byproduct of shifting to new design. One of my points of contention with the old tool was that, translating existing captions, you couldn't split lines predetermined by the translation aid, and that's no longer the case. That's good. The plus button on the top of the list now creates new text block to the right of the playhead. But you can also add one directly after an existing block by pressing the plus under the line on the list. You can determine where it ends by placing the playhead further on the timeline. Otherwise, it will either add a short block you can stretch later if the playhead was placed before the gap, or automatically snap it to the next block if it was placed after. As for the playhead, it's no longer semi-static. You can summon it to any point on the timeline by simply clicking there. If you've made a mistake, you now have the ability to undo a few previous steps. But on the flip side, the draft no longer saves automatically. It reminds you to save the progress when you're closing the tool, but it would still be wise to develop a habit of saving regularly. Another feature that wasn't in the classic tool is the ability to swap between timing mode and transcript mode on the fly. Good for putting down the groundwork on a fresh video, fixing up an auto-generated track, or proofreading a track at your own pace. Alright, that's all the changes I've noticed so far. Now let's get down to grapes and my suggestions for how they can be smoothed over. Since the old editor is no longer accessible, I won't always be able to make a direct comparison, so I'll be using similar features in other editors to illustrate what I'm talking about. One of the first things I mentioned about this iteration of Caption Editor is that all the elements are spread out, and while it makes the tool more accessible to newcomers, it's also rather wasteful for those who already have their routine set. Let's look at the old design for comparison. As you can see, it's airtight. All the elements are glued to each other, and as soon as your mouse leaves one element, it's already hovering over another, which means you don't have a lot of mouse commute. The new design, however, while looking airy, has a lot of dead space.
What the hell?
No, Isaac! Not this time. In addition, with the size of some elements increased and some new ones being added or moved around, other parts of the tool had to be shrunk and unnecessarily divided. The previous screen became notably smaller, and there are two bars between it and the timeline now, which means if you're using the mouse to pause and unpause the video in between adjusting the text blocks, you now have to travel this extra distance up and down every time. It sounds like a minor gripe, but it's an action you could be doing for hundreds or even thousands of times per video, so it adds up. The band-aid solution here would be to move the bars up, so the screen and the timeline were once again next to each other. But I have a more radical suggestion in mind as well. Why not make the positions and sizes of major elements adjustable? I'd gladly sacrifice extra timeline length for more lines in a column, especially for the sake of translation where half the space is occupied with aids. On top of that, I'd really appreciate an option to switch to a more compact angular design, closer to the original one. I don't need the timing boxes this big, since I adjust timing with the mouse, and in fact would gladly collapse them all together if it meant more space for the preview screen. And look how much space we can free up by fusing the deletion icon with the text box itself. The add line buttons, on the other hand, could really use some enlargement. It's not that easy to snipe them as they are. Some of that goes contrary to the vision I sense behind this new design, so that's why I'd rather have a separate design option, rather than try and contort this one into something that kinda sorta works for everyone, probably. Going forward, I'll be referring to that hypothetical option as efficient, and go with friendly for the current one. Another thing that I'd welcome in regards to the new design is the ability to resize the editor's outer frame, or even just spread it completely inside the window. I don't see why we shouldn't utilize all this extra space. It may not be an issue for someone with a decently sized monitor, but as a proud owner of a budget laptop, I suffer. The old design also made me feel like I could use a bigger monitor sometimes, but at the very least I never felt like I need a magnifying glass. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest issue I have with the new editor right now: timeline and waveform. However, first I'll say something nice, and it's that I like the change to the design of the text blocks. Previously, they tried to cram all the text you put in the text box inside the block itself, and it was pointless since you couldn't do anything with it. It served as a way to show which line is assigned to each block, and you only need the first few words for that anyway. So, solid change. On the other hand, however, adjusting the blocks became more strenuous. Previously, whenever you wanted to stretch a block, it would spawn handles on the sides, so you could easily tell which one you're going to be adjusting. In the new design, it only shows the standard Windows resize cursor, and it's the same for both sides. Can you tell which block I'm going to snag? I can't. And the aim has to be almost pixel perfect for some reason. Furthermore, if the playhead is located nearby, now that's competing for the cursor's attention as well. I'll return to the playhead in a bit, but for the blocks I'd say friendly design would benefit from big, permanent rounded handles, like they have at Amara for example. Most of the elements of friendly design have rounded edges, and angular blocks look a bit out of place to begin with. However, personally I like their minimalistic look, even though I don't understand why they have to be so thin. And for the efficient design would suggest to trade the handles for a simple change of the cursor. The next gripe is the waveform, and this is a big one. Firstly, I find it way too pale. It needs more contrast with the background. Secondly, it could use some vertical definition. As is, it can be hard to judge anything by looking at it, since the wave is so samey and timid. I'd suggest to have an option to drop the spikes to the bottom as it was before, so they had more space to stretch into. Also, personally, I always found it easier to catch a point in delivery when it's laid out on the floor and not suspended in the air. Could be just me though. Nextly, as you can clearly see at maximum scale, the waveform is divided into separate spikes. So, at the default scale, which is presumably most convenient for adjusting text blocks, it looks striped. And when the playback starts moving the timeline, it starts shimmering. Again, it could be a non-issue for people with higher monitor refresh rates, but mine only goes up to 60, and this is painful. It's further compounded by that the playhead is not standing still either, and is sort of jittering about, sometimes wildly, which is frustrating and disorienting when you're trying to stop playback at the right moment. It slowly edges its way to the right end of the timeline, and can run off the screen completely.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Also, if you're navigating the video through the preview, the timeline doesn't follow, which is annoying. Since I've mentioned scale, that has a glaring issue as well. Unlike scaling in the classic editor, we don't have a true slider anymore, but 5 preset positions, and they are influenced by the length of the video itself. That is a mortal flaw. The first 3 positions may have some situational use, I guess, and the maximum scale is... what? So the default scale is the one that is supposed to see the most use. However, since it's not a set scale, but a percentage one, if the video reaches a certain duration, it ceases being a workable option either. Here's one of my updates. It's 2 minutes long. I have no issues with adjusting the blocks. If anything, they feel a bit too stretched and noodly, but no big deal. Now here's a video that goes for over an hour. I can no longer do anything with any degree of precision. Moving a block by a fraction of a millimeter too far, I could be throwing the line noticeably out of sync. And some blocks become smaller than the cursor itself. Tying the scale to the percentage of the video was not a right decision. This is where I initially complained about editor lagging like crazy on long videos. But since the time I first started jotting down notes a month ago, performance must have had a boost, since I couldn't replicate the problem. Still, some of the actions that used to happen instantly now happen after a delay, to the point where I have to speed up some of my footages, but it used to be way worse. Hopefully that's an indication of that the tool is getting its post-launch fine-tuning. Now, in regards to the playhead, I have 3 suggestions to make. First is to optionally limit its interactive area to just the upper end, maybe even give it a visual handle there, showing which part is draggable, while keeping the pin itself from interacting with the cursor, so it wouldn't interfere with you adjusting the blocks. Second suggestion I have is making the playhead magnetic, so you could snap the blocks together without worrying that you've left a little gap that is going to cause flickering, or push the timing off the mark. The final option I would be glad to have is to make the playhead semi-static, like the one in the classic editor. There, it was tied to the frame of the timeline, rather than the timeline itself. In other words, you could move it about, but it could never leave the visible part of the timeline. That worked well with another feature of the classic editor which is currently missing in the revamped version, and that is timeline dragging. It allowed to quickly navigate to the part of the timeline that's just outside of the visible box. You could do it with the left click or the middle mouse button. Right now, the left click summons the playhead, but the middle mouse button is still free. You can navigate using the scroll bar at the bottom, but even on a 15-minute video, it's way too sensitive to be used in the same way, so having the dragging back would be ideal. Plus, for some reason, the handle on the slide bar is only half its height, so if you want to move the timeline, you have to snipe it first. Next, I have to return to the ability to split the pre-planned lines during translation. It's good to have this freedom now, but it currently has a caveat. You see, when you split a line all by itself, it divides into 2 separate boxes at the position of the playhead. That's helpful. However, if the line is followed by another text box, the second half of the sentence gets pushed in there, even if it's already occupied. That's unhelpful. It happens with original language captions as well, but translation suffers the most here, since that's where you'll most likely encounter sentences in need of splitting. It's just the nature of translation, sentences usually increase in length a bit. And since translation aid transfers the timing from the original, the next text box will almost always be there. You can work around it by shrinking the next box in advance, and then stretching it back, but as I've already described, that's finicky in and of itself right now. Ticking a checkbox somewhere to always split would be a relief. Another option I would appreciate would be setting the direction in which the block is added to the timeline. It would enable the previously available workflow where you could listen to the delivery up to a good cutoff point, then stop playback and add a block to fill the empty stretch up. The option to add a block after an existing line is there, but it's not the same as free placing, and the button you need to click for it is wandering around. The last thing about the blocks is that previously you could delete them by highlighting them on the timeline and pressing delete, but not anymore. Not an essential feature by any metric, but hey, quality of life is quality of life. And speaking of which, the new color scheme is brighter than the original, and even that one could have used a darker theme. So, dark mode please. Some people are going to be spending a lot of time staring at this tool. My next gripe is specific to us Russians and concerns the hotkeys. Thing is, the Russian comma input is a Shift+ combination. As we all know, commas are followed by spaces, and with Shift plus space being the pause and pause playback combo, you can guess what happens if you're typing even moderately fast. So the ability to change that to something like Control plus space would be welcome. Another thing that would be nice to see is basic text formatting. Not sure if it's doable with the current default file format, but I know some things can be done with it if you're willing to jump through hoops for them. even if it just gets italicizing, it would help with signposting stresses. Caps works in most situations, but not with the word I, for example, and it's quite often the one that's being stressed. And lastly, all since the sneak peek way back when, I was hoping we'd get to set the scale of the line on the preview screen to how it's going to look when published. Paired with the full screen option, that would allow us to make a final revision before publication and check that nothing bloated up too much, there are no unnecessary separations, and subtitles look as intended start to finish. So that's it for the features that currently are in the editor, or were there before the upgrade. However, I have a couple more suggestions to make, or maybe it's more akin to requests. For the first one, I'll say straight away that I haven't seen anything like it in any caption editor, so I'm not sure if it's even doable, but if it is, I'd find it a huge help to be able to add a separate line with its own timing. Imagine captioning an interview or a podcast episode, where, due to its unscripted and rehearsed nature, speakers sometimes talk over each other. Or maybe the creator plays a song while narrating, and the lyrics add context to their words, but run out of sync with delivery. Or maybe a certain sound plays and you need to bring it up for deaf people. Or maybe there is a line of text with commentary that the author added during editing. Such instances are not uncommon, and instead of sitting there and making a canapé out of different combinations of parts to simulate separate timing, it would be nice to just, do the thing. The second request is to realign the placement of captions and banners and ad warnings in a video. Let the banners and timers pop up above captions, instead of pushing them up. It is immensely frustrating when the line you're reading is being suddenly jerked away. So that's it for the immediate feedback. Now it's time to look at what a contributor can do while the captioning permission is still in the oven. And, to be completely realistic, even after it's out. Because let's face it, getting a free access to even a portion of someone's channel's infrastructure requires a level of trust that doesn't come overnight. How can a person begin gaining goodwill if they can't submit a contribution as a ceremonial offering anymore? Well, actually that's still possible, albeit in a roundabout way. I'll describe 3 ways you can still supply your favorite channel with caption tracks. Of course, the easiest and all-around most convenient way would be to just come over to the creator's house and caption the video on their machine, but given our current circumstances, sadly, that's off the table. So what's the next best thing? Enter Subtitle Horse. There are other third-party editors, of course, but this is the one I've been working with, so that's the one I'll be talking about. It has a free version, and it doesn't hide anything essential behind a subscription, so it's perfect for generating a subtitle file you could then mail over to the creator you want to support. Right out of the door, you can see that many issues I've had with the YouTube editor are not present here. The color scheme is nice and dark, the elements of the tool occupy all the available space. The waveform is precise and easily readable, the stretchy blocks have clear telegraphing, and so on. The tool can work with the video from a URL or a local source, and I would recommend local source since it enables generating the waveform. I won't describe how the tool works in detail since, if you already know the basic principle, you'll find your way around it anyway, and if you don't, there are guides and tutorials right there on the site. However, I'll share a few little insights that may save you some frustration. First of all, even though Subtitle Horse tracks your draft progress automatically, it saves it in your browser's cache, so it's a good idea to save it locally now and again. Same goes for the settings you've tweaked, so don't forget to set them again if you've absent-mindedly ran CCleaner or something. Speaking of settings, there are 2 that deserve your attention specifically if you're planning to be generating tracks for YouTube. The first one is gap between titles, which is set to 4 milliseconds by default. I would recommend dropping it to a 0, so you could glue the blocks together and avoid creating flickering. The other option concerns the minimal duration of the line. On YouTube, that limit is half a second, but in this editor such limit doesn't exist. If you set a line to be shorter than half a second, it will simply create an error when you upload the file onto the YouTube, and won't display. You can't set the minimal duration of the line itself, but you can set up a validation flag for that, to be aware. There are other numbers you can tweak for the validation bar, but let's say you have your way of doing things, and this information is meaningless to you. Well, you can do this, and enjoy a bigger preview. Isn't that wonderful? And lastly, when you start your work, the timeline is zoomed all the way out. so don't forget to zoom to select it to bring it to optimal scale. The rest is your standard fare. Create a text box, fill it up, stretch it appropriately. Repeat until done. For the negatives, I can say that playback tracking is a bit loose. Playback eventually starts running a bit ahead, the same way it is on YouTube right now. The playhead is wiggly as well, although it hardly matters with waveform being this clear. My biggest annoyance is atrocious mouse commute. Look at this. I have to travel across the entire screen for every single line. That gets tiring quickly. I wish there was a way to assemble a custom bar out of whatever buttons and shortcuts you need, and place it somewhere near the timeline so your mouse work was limited to one small area. What can I say? I'm a simpleton. Key combinations are too intimidating for my thick cranium. So that's Subtitle Horse for you. Certainly an overkill for what YouTube requires, but you won't hear me complaining about it. However, if for some reason you want to have other options, then there is another type of beast. EGSub is a free caption editor you can download onto your machine. No need to worry about accidentally clearing your cache or even having internet access anymore. You just need a source video and the will to learn your way around the tool. Good idea to keep it around just in case. It's not very pretty and can feel clunky, but it's functional, and honestly that's all that matters. One caveat is that it generates the file in the ASS format, which YouTube doesn't accept. But you can easily convert it online, so it's just one extra step. Finally, there is the option of privately uploading the video you wanted to write captions for onto your own channel, and using the in-house tool. This way, you could ensure that the subtitles look fine on YouTube without sweating that something got borked. On the other hand, as we've already covered, the in-house tool is not the best it can be right now. Plus, not every creator will be okay with their content being ferried around like that, especially if you're approaching them for the first time. Also, one last caveat all three options share is that if you're translating the captions into another language, you no longer have access to title and description. You have to translate them in a separate text file and send them over so the creator could copy and paste them manually. So there you have it. 3 ways to supply your favorite creator with accurate, handcrafted captions, even without direct access. If you were planning to dip your toe into YouTube captioning and then felt like you've missed your chance when the community submissions feature fell off, now you know it's not the case. You can still do the work and lay down a foundation of trust for when the permission rolls out. Just remember this: a creator may only have a measured amount of time and energy to devote to their captions. That's why they may use auto-timing for a pre-written script or scan through auto-generated captions to make them more palatable and settle for that. You, however, have it as your sole task. If you've decided to use your wits, your judgment, your passion and dedication to make a video accessible to someone new, there is no room for shortcuts. Be patient and persistent. Don't rush to the finish, don't skip steps. If you have doubts, you need to ask questions, not take guesses. And if you feel tired, you need to rest, not give up. The community feature didn't get a new lease of life because it wasn't used enough to warrant a renewal. Low quality of community-generated submissions was among the reasons cited for the lack of engagement with the feature. This is where meaningful change can be made. Make sure that when someone turns captions on, they'd see that the track was written not just for this video, but for this very channel. That it carries its vibe and serves as a way to fully include the reader into the experience the creator intended. If the author made a logical stress, show it. If they made a dramatic pause, account for it. Split sentences meaningfully. Describe significant sound cues. Name tag speakers if there is more than one or if they are citing someone. The standard you're setting for yourself may later become a bar of quality for someone else. And if you're a creator and you're investing into your channel, consider including a dedicated caption writer with the artists, editors, and other talent you're employing. Translation is a tricky subject, but with the video's native language, you're going to be fully capable of judging how good a job they're doing. Pluck someone out from your community. You'll keep it in the family and support independent talent. Just don't forget that the ability to credit your contribution in a description is no longer there. It's all anonymous now, unless you tip your hat to the contributor on social media, or let them include their signature in the caption track itself. It takes a lot of scrupulous work to make a caption track that really clicks in place, start to finish, so don't let that go unrecognized. But you may think, of course you would say that. What about someone who actually had to pay for captions? That is a fair point. I only know one person that fits this description, so let's ask him.
Hey, I'm Mandalore. I run the Mandalore gaming channel. Fancy that. I've been at the YouTube thing a while, and I'd like to think that I do okay at it. As you'd expect, most early viewers are ones who could speak and understand English like I can. Things have progressed to where now most viewers come from countries that don't speak English as a primary language. You can chalk some of that up to education and people learning English on their own proficiently, but there's also a sizable portion of my audience that doesn't speak English at all. Besides, that first group didn't really show up until I started using captions and subtitles. Without using them, the second group would have never shown up at all. People regularly expect them and even ask me when they're coming or if there's a delay on them. Not just the foreign language speakers either, as there's still the deaf community and the hard of hearing community to consider. Adding captions goes beyond being an accessibility thing and just a nice thing to have in general. That should be your primary concern, but if you're more pragmatic than that, it's also good for your success. Having them widens the amount of people who can actually watch and understand your video, which increases your chances of getting noticed and things being spread around. Recently, YouTube has made it harder for people to contribute to this through first-party tools, but going back to earlier in the video, there are good third-party options available. From my end, it's still well worth hiring people to contribute to these, even if it's more of a process than it was before. I occasionally get people emailing me their own contributions they made through one of the third-party editors, and it's a big help. On the YouTuber side of things, if you can get good, high-quality captions and translations, there's no reason not to implement them. They're nothing but beneficial and a worthwhile endeavor.
Thank you. In conclusion, the new in-house caption editor could use more love. The major things to focus on would be the stability of the tool and all that pertains to the bootleg quality timeline and waveform. Those are pressing issues. Every ounce of energy you spend fighting the editor is not going towards ensuring the quality of your captions. The big visual things like the color scheme and overall size of the window and active zones of elements are a close second. In its current state, I find the tool more frustrating than helpful. With lag, choppiness and dodgy elements of the interface, I never really felt in control, and I find it ironic that it's this editor that made me feel like I'm wrangling a horse. If I were to pass a verdict, I'd say it's fine for basic work, especially on smaller videos, but for anything more involved, right now, I find it prohibitively unrefined. Overall, it just feels like work in progress. If it is, because it had to be shipped early for example, and it is going to take time and feedback and testing to bring it to its intended state, then I'm all for it. I believe no tool is going to serve the platform better than the one that is integrated into it. However, if it is what it is and that's that, then it just can't compete with dedicated alternatives. And I think it could. I thank everyone for waiting patiently while this video was being made. It certainly took longer than I anticipated. Although last time I did something like this it took 3 months, so progress. I'm returning to my usual stuff now, as there is catching up to do. Next update will likely only happen next year, so happy holidays folks. Cheers.